It's 3:45 and it's time to get started with our next presenter. Our next presenter is Jeff Rawls with Catahoula Resources. I want to give you a brief introduction of Jeff and then have him go ahead and talk about carbon capture and sequestration here in Nebraska. Jeff Rawls is the founding CEO of Catahoula Resources and a senior advisor for the Energy and Minerals Group, bringing 33 years of energy industry experience. Prior to joining EMG in 2008, Rawls served as managing director at Bear Energy, where he was responsible for identifying strategic midstream investments throughout the North American. Vice president at Kinder Morgan, where he led a newly created business team focused on developing midstream projects in the Rocky Mountain region, which included the development of the Rockies Express Pipeline. He was co-founder and managing partner of Tiger Midstream Investments, vice president of natural gas trading, Origination and Producer Services at Calpine Energy Services, LP. Rawls held previous positions at Enron Corporation, ranging from pipeline engineering to natural gas trading. In addition to serving as a director of Catahoula Resources, LLC, Rawls is a director on several other portfolio companies. Rawls graduated from the Louisiana State University with a BS in Petroleum Engineering in 1987. He received an MBA from the University of Houston in 1997. So we welcome you to the great state of Nebraska and look forward to your presentation, Jeff.
Thanks a lot, Pam. Let's see if I can pass the first test and get my presentation uploaded here. Let's see here. All right, well, I hope you guys can see this. I don't know, Jessica, if you are there, you could let me know if you can see this.
Can see it. We could just a second ago. Did you?
1 second. What's that, Jessica?
Can you click it back onto the screen? It was on there a minute ago.
Okay.
There we go.
All right, great. Sorry about that. When I get behind the steering wheel here, it's a little bit difficult. So as Pam said, thank you, Pam, for the introduction. I know Roger had to leave a bit early, but thank Roger Berry as well for inviting us to participate today. As Pam said, I'm Jeff Rawls, the CEO of Catahoula Resources. I'm a senior advisor for the Energy and Minerals Group. Today, we're going to give you an overview of our proposed Nebraska intrastate carbon capture and storage midstream investment opportunity to support the renewable fuels industry in Nebraska. As we go through the presentation, I'll walk through who we are, what we're doing, what we have done, the criteria we have to develop a midstream project, tell you why we think Nebraska is in a unique position to be a leader in the energy transition, specifically with carbon capture, the flyover of our proposed project, and then we'll wrap it up and hopefully have some time for a little bit of Q&A. So the next slide here, a little bit about Catahoula Resources. Before I get into that, maybe I can level set on how we see the midstream industry. What is the midstream industry and how does it impact what's going on in Nebraska? So if you step back and look at the midstream industry, there's about 2.5 million miles of steel pipeline that's been installed and currently is operational in the United States. That 2.5 million miles was designed by midstream experts and is operated by midstream experts, and it moves a variety of product. When we talk about midstream, it's from the origination source of a producer, and we transport it through infrastructure to a destination, whether it's going to be sequestration, an example today, or to demand markets. So with that being said, it's CO2 is a very interesting opportunity that we see. We've been studying emerging opportunities for our entire careers in the midstream space. And as you look at our management team, the 4 key leaders in our leadership team, we all have, roughly 30 years of experience. We're the kind of guys that go to sleep thinking about midstream, and we wake up thinking about midstream. Our team has extensive CO2 technical experience, commercial and operational. And to put that level of experience in perspective, one of our key members is John Filiatro. Prior to joining us a year ago, he was a senior vice president with Denbury Resources. He was responsible for over 1,300 miles of the CO2 pipeline systems from design, operations, construction, etc. Put that in perspective, when going back and looking at the 2.5 million miles of steel pipeline in the U.S., only 5,000 miles of that is CO2. So John Filiatro designed, operated, and managed right at 25% of the CO2 pipelines in the U.S. That being said, you can count on one hand the number of guys in the United States that have that kind of experience. And so that is by design and how we created the team. That's part of what we need to make sure we have when we pursue emerging opportunities. Other, skill sets that we have on the team is a track record of identifying emerging midstream opportunities. And in that, just talk about my experience at EMG. I won't bore you with the other couple of decades prior to that. But I've been at EMG since 2008, and the objective of going there was to be with a well-capitalized sponsor to go out and identify these emerging midstream opportunities. 2008, we started following the geology because our main thesis is where does the geology intersect with commercialization, meaning it's an emerging opportunity. And as we looked at the shale revolution, where Shell was able to produce natural gas, it was in the late 2000s when that really became a proven technology. So as we did our assessment, we looked around the country, wound up focusing in Appalachia region of the U.S. And in the Appalachia region, you have both the Marcellus Shale and Utica Shale. So 2009, when we got comfortable with the geology, and if the geology works, that the commercial implications would make producer customers more competitive in their markets, we decided to begin investing. And over the last decade and a half, we've invested in 5 intrastate midstream projects in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And the average size of those investments range from a couple of $100 million to several billion dollars. And as a result of that, and other folks participating in the Appalachia region and emerging midstream investments, the Appalachia Basin was effectively producing no gas in 2008. Today, it is over 35 billion cubic feet a day, the largest natural gas producing basin in the U.S. and one of the top 5 producing basins in the world. Fast forward a little bit later, 2010, 2011, again, using where does geology intersect with the commercialization opportunity, we went to West Texas. We've installed 2 intrastate gathering systems in West Texas. And one, for example, complete greenfield, no pipelines, today has over 1,200 miles of aggregation systems, and up through those systems, over 25% of the oil produced in the Permian Basin today goes through those assets. Put a little perspective, when we got into the Permian Basin, it was producing right about 1 million barrels a day. It's producing over 4 million barrels a day. Largest oil field in the United States, one of the largest oil fields in the world. So with that, as we look at these emerging opportunities, we see a clear pathway in Nebraska to go after an intrastate build out that will help producer customers, specifically the renewable fuels, i.e. ethanol producers, lower their CI score, lower their carbon footprint, and do this at a relatively rapid pace considering its emerging opportunity. From a capital sponsor standpoint, the Energy and Minerals Group, it's a true private equity investor, not only in the United States, but globally. On the midstream side in the U.S., we're one of the largest investors in midstream infrastructure, always focused on emerging opportunities, and currently have about $10 billion of assets under management. Catahoula is a Fund 5 portfolio company, and just as Catahoula, EMG is focused on hard assets that are integral to existing and growing markets. Next slide here, for those of you that are not familiar with carbon capture and storage, on the right side of the page is an illustration. Carbon CCS is clearly a midstream industry investment, all the way from the capture side of it through the transmission of the product to the sequestration. And typically in the CO2 sequestration, unless it's being used for EOR, it's at least 3,000+ feet deep below the earth. Some of the key on the left side of the page, this is, I'm sure looks relatively simple, but it's actually very complicated. But to walk you through it pretty quickly, the key project evaluation requirements, all of these 5 parameters have to work in concert. You cannot have 4 or 3 out of 5. You have to have all 5. It's kind of like a 3-legged stool. If you have one leg missing, it just doesn't work. So when we think of technical, I'll just start at top and go around. They're all of equal importance. On the technical side, we really have to go with what we call a proven approach, meaning that the geology has to be there. In the case of sequestration, the volumetrics, the geomechanics, et cetera, have to be empirically there for us to pursue with these type of large investments. We have to have experts on our team that are in the top, quartile of anyone in this industry. And with CCS, this is even a more specific requirement related to high pressure CO2 capture and transportation. And then kind of a last point here is proven technology. You hear a lot about carbon capture today, and it ranges from taking full emissions off of a refinery to smaller opportunities like fertilizer plants. And in the case of what we're looking at here, we're going for the high concentration CO2 emission sources. And we, over the last 3 years, as we have been trying to develop CCS through the emerging midstream market, the ethanol plants really jumped out, and we'll get into a little bit more detail as to why. From a commercial standpoint, bottom line is our producer customers have to be more competitive after we install the midstream infrastructure, or there's no reason to install the midstream infrastructure. And then given the large scale of investment required, the amount of capital, obviously we have to make sure that it is profitable as well. Another key tenet on the commercial aspect is that we look for other upside opportunities here. And a perfect example is power plant. The technology to recover CO2 from power plant emissions is quickly evolving, and the placement of our project that we're trying in Nebraska, it should be timed pretty well for that emerging technology as well. From a social standpoint, we need to be aligned with the stakeholders, not only specific to our producers, but the landowners and the communities that we're involved with. And in this particular case, given the agricultural base within Nebraska, as we've heard already so far, beginning with the governor today, that box is pretty checked. From a regulatory standpoint, our investment criteria, there needs to be regulatory laws and rules in place, and that there needs to be some optimism on pushing forward with new policies that help spur investment in emerging midstream opportunities. From an environmental standpoint, obviously, our mandate is minimal impact, whether it's landowners, whether it's emissions, or whether it's a type of product, moving through the pipelines. In this particular case, CO2, non-flammable, non-combustible product moving through a pipeline. So it checks that box as well. So I know I'm going through this relatively rapidly, but you can probably see and assume a lot of other aspects within each of these buckets. But as I walk through the project, hopefully you'll see how it checks all the boxes and where Nebraska stands on that. So why Nebraska? Let me see. It looks like my slide is not quite. There you go. Sorry about this, folks. Okay, so why Nebraska? So Nebraska, we feel Nebraska is actionable. It's not a pipe dream. It's a state that can control its own destiny, working with the political, within the political environment. It has the economic impact to help farmers and to help the ethanol renewable industry through a CCS project. So it lines up very well in how we look at emerging projects. Very proactive agricultural industry. Obviously, the second largest ethanol producer in the United States, well in excess. I think the capacity is 2.6 billion gallons per year. As the governor stated earlier, we had 2.5 billion, but somewhere in that genre, very large. The government within Nebraska, very forward thinking. On the previous page where I said, when I was going over regulatory, if you look at emerging regulatory or evolving regulatory environment, perfect example is LB 650. This will clearly outline pore space, liability, and other important features for Nebraska to develop CCS within the state to help its ethanol business. Another key component of why we think Nebraska is in a prime pole position to move forward is the experience in geology and midstream development. Nebraska has substantial subsurface mapping across the state. It has given us a lot of visibility with empirical data, as well as well control as to where the right volumetrics, geomechanics, as I mentioned earlier, and other subsurface requirements. Checks the box there. Existing midstream infrastructure tied to ethanol plants. So you'll see a map here in a couple of slides, but effectively every ethanol plant today in Nebraska is tied into the Nebraska midstream infrastructure. And on top of that, just about every ethanol plant in Nebraska is tied to power transmission as well. So between those two conduits, we see a lot of opportunity to minimize impact, specifically land impact, when pipeline right-of-ways are required to move this product. The bottom portion of the page here, CO2 intrastate midstream system. This is the buzzword for the entire project, and that is it's intrastate, and probably deserves a little bit of time to explain what that means and why not an interstate project. From an intrastate project perspective, Nebraska has the opportunity to work within its own four corners, if you will. It avoids a conflicting and misalignment among other states or jurisdictions, agendas, et cetera, as we have stated on the page here. An example of that would be if I am an emitter of CO2 in one state, and as a result of the capturing of that CO2 in the source state, the producers are getting a higher net back, or they're more competitive, but then those producers will want to transport that CO2 to another state that is not getting economic benefit. To us, that means it's a pretty big headwind, and a lot of misalignment happens. And we have seen this, and personally I've seen it for decades, that whenever you develop outside of an intrastate system, that level of friction or risk added to a project becomes pretty challenging. The other, aspect of Nebraska, as I stated, is just a close proximity and the high concentration of ethanol plants throughout Nebraska. And I'll show you a map or a graphic as we do a flyover on our project. So what opportunity, again, intrastate carbon capture storage. As I said earlier, when we look at emerging opportunities, it's it's where the rock intersects with commercialization. So starting with the rock here, for many years, in relatively recent years, from either public or private evaluation, looking for ample permanent sequestration for CO2, the southwestern portion of Nebraska is estimated to have the capacity to hold tens of billions of tons of CO2. Put a little perspective around that. If you look at the 20 plus ethanol plants in the state of Nebraska, we estimate that emission to be around 7 million tons per year. The entire state of Nebraska is roughly a little over 50 tons per year. So just in the southwest portion of Nebraska, the state of Nebraska can sequester not only CO2 emissions from its ethanol industry, but also from other industries within the state. So that's for us, that checks both the base project and some potential upside. Going to the next slide, proximal high concentration CO2 sources. Each of the red dots scaled are different sizes just because they're scaled to the amount of emissions. But as you can see, these plants are in relatively close proximity. And when you're talking about building midstream infrastructure, the closer these plants are, the more capital efficient your project design can be. And another very interesting and unique aspect about the location and distribution of these ethanol plants throughout Nebraska is that you don't have to go big with your first project. You can do a smaller project, medium project, and grow into a larger scale project. So we are talking to multiple ethanol plant owners and operators throughout Nebraska, and the opportunity to work with one or then in all of the plants simultaneously is what we're trying to figure out what makes the most sense. But the really good news is that we have the opportunity to flex and grow into a larger footprint. As I mentioned earlier, again, I know these slides you're probably familiar with, but the existing midstream corridors throughout Nebraska. Nebraska has thousands of miles of established midstream facilities. And with that, that means that at some point in time, that right-of-way was disturbed. And so the advantage for us to develop additional midstream infrastructure is that we can parallel and adjacent and build adjacent to this existing right-of-way or disturbed right-of-way, thus minimizing our environmental footprint. So this is, kind of how we see the project looking at this point. Sequestration located within the southwestern portion of Nebraska. Aggregation from east to west, and it's a self-contained system. So went through the slides pretty quickly here. I guess we're going to have a lot more time for Q&A. So why now? Nebraska is positioned to be first to market, and I know there's a lot of questions as to when, how long does the project take to get built? How long will the other upside opportunities for Nebraska be there? I think a question was posed to the governor today, what about LCFS in the state of Nebraska and other states? We want to work with ethanol producers in the state of Nebraska to be first to market. We're going to avoid a lot of the headwinds and move forward with a project. The leadership role in evolving ethane as a sustainable, renewable fuel, preaching to the choir here, I'm sure, because Nebraska has a leadership position in making that work. And why another very important piece, not only for the ag energy industry within Nebraska, but also other emission sources within Nebraska. If we're able to put this midstream infrastructure in now, other sources of CO2 emissions are going to be able to tie into our system for permanent sequestration. And if Nebraska by itself, the power industry and the agriculture industry, if both of those could capture their CO2 and permanently sequester it, state of Nebraska can reduce its carbon footprint by 50%. So it's a pretty powerful message to the state of Nebraska to work within the state to effectuate a project. So the right development team, we feel that that's us, given our experience, not only in CO2, but our track record of effectuating these emerging midstream opportunities, our track record of safety, compliance, and stewardship with respect to the environment, and just the focus that we have in understanding the midstream business. So what's next for our project? Our project, we've been working on our project for two and a half to 3 years. We've been intentionally focused a little bit behind the curtain here until we got comfortable with the 5 major aspects that I showed in the previous slide. We feel that this project, all those boxes are checked, and now we need to go out and get alignment with customers. And so a lot of you may be watching this today. We've already spoken with. If not, we're probably going to be trying to speak with you at some point in the near future. And we'd like to work with you to see what your needs are and your relative to timing your capture needs, and just other aspects of your business. And at the end of the day, Catahoula, our objective is to provide an environmentally responsible and sustainable intrastate project. So I know I went through that pretty quickly. Some of it was intentional because I know it's late in the day and people may have a little popcorn hangover from the goodie boxes. But this is our presentation. Be more than happy to answer questions now or follow up with you personally. So I will try to get out of this screen. Give me 1 second.
Great, Jeff. That was a really good presentation. I think that's good news for Nebraska. The intrastate project, I think, has its uniqueness in that it is just within the borders of the state and presents or avoids, I think, some of the issues that you mentioned as far as trying to go cross borders to other states. I've got one question up here. I'm going to have you unmute your mic, if you will. And let me read this question from Devin Mogler. Devin asks, if the Nebraska legislature passes LB 650 and gains primacy over Class 6 well permitting, is there still an avenue for the federal EPA to supersede their authority and delay or nix a project?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Devin. I don't know enough about the ability through the potential 650 for EPA to come back in and nix a project, but the relationship, whether you're in the state of North Dakota, for example, and have primacy, or state of Wyoming, you still have to have a monitoring plan that's approved by the EPA. Although in Nebraska, Nebraska does not have primacy. You have to go through EPA Region 7, but the monitoring plan needs to be approved through Washington. So I guess there's a possibility we'd have to look into that and how it relates to 650. But really, the main focus on, or at least from us, from LB 650 is pore space and liability. Okay. Clarity.
Good. And just to give an update for people that don't know, LB 650 had a hearing in the Natural Resources Committee at the Nebraska Unicameral this year. It was designated as a priority for which makes it coming out to the general file of the unicameral, and Senator Dan Hughes designated that as his priority bill. So we've passed the first hurdle on that, and hoping everything goes well. I heard the hearing was extremely successful, a lot of people presented very good information and knowledge. So several other questions popping up here. Let me read these off to you, Jeff. Somebody's asking about the rock, that graphic that you had with the rock in Nebraska. Is that across all of Nebraska, or is that just in the square? I'm assuming the southwest square.
Yeah, the southwest corner of Nebraska. Well, the geology that we outlined there, that's with empirical data to support significant permanent storage of CO2. It has the geochemistry there, et cetera. But there are other volumetric studies being conducted throughout the state that move towards the center of the state, and there could be opportunities to store beyond that piece. That's just when we look at from an investment thesis, we have to have empirical data. But there is a potential to store in other areas of the state.
Okay. Someone's asking probably a little more specific, has a site or specific sites been identified for injection yet?
Yes, we are looking at specific sites within the state of Nebraska for permanent sequestration. And as we, verify those plans, we'll be more public with it. But at this point in time, we have identified a couple of sites. Okay.
This is about the pipelines. Are there existing pipelines that could be purchased to move the CO2 already?
CO2, when you think about it, the most efficient way to transport CO2 is a supercritical phase, meaning that it's liquid. And to operate in a liquid phase, the CO2 needs to be roughly a little over 2,000 pounds per square inch. And so most pipelines in the U.S., much less Nebraska. They were built, they're 1,440 pounds maximum allowable operating pressure or less. So directionally, I think the answer is no. Just from an efficiency standpoint, I'm pretty confident the answer is no. But there could be a short haul, inefficient use of pre-existing pipelines that could move CO2, but not on the scale that we're talking about for this project.
Okay. All right. That helps. Good. These are great questions. Is there a specific geologic horizon identified for sequestration? And if so, how deep?
Yeah. So again, kind of going back to the rock and the geochemistry, if you think about supercritical CO2, you have to be at a minimum of roughly 2,500 feet below the surface to maintain that supercritical nature of CO2. So depending on where you are within the state of Nebraska and what, horizons are acceptable for permanent sequestration. So the answer is there are multiple formations that can handle sequestration, but we think the minimum depth, just based on a normal pressure gradient, needs to be in excess of roughly 3,000 feet.
3,000. Okay. All right, good. This is a real basic question. We've got sequestration, and then we also say storage. Same thing, or are they two different things?
They're synonymous.
Okay.
Correct.
All right. I thought so, but I thought, well, I'm just going to ask the basic question. All right. Here's a more technical question. Is there any thought about selling CO2 storage to other states to generate revenue?
It's a great question. I think other states in the U.S. are definitely trying to figure that out. In my example earlier of CO2 emissions captured in one state and moved to another state, I can only assume that the receiving state for sequestration or storage of the CO2 would probably require some sort of compensation for that. Within the project that we're looking at now, it's all within the state of Nebraska. So the sequestration for CO2 directly benefits the stakeholders in Nebraska.
Okay.
So we try to avoid that. It's a great question. It's a complicated question. And I don't think anyone can answer that question today because it hasn't been done.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Are there other, I'm going to say subcontractors for the lack of a better word, that would help with, say, on the capture side at the ethanol plants? Or is this a fully contained project for Catahoula?
Yeah, right now it's a fully integrated project for Catahoula. And that's a great question, Pam. If you really look at the midstream infrastructure, it's broken out in capture, transportation, and sequestration. On the capture side, what's very fortunate for this project is the technology required is decades old. You simply need an amine plant, dehydration, and 4 stages of compression to get it from atmospheric pressure to the north of the 2,000 PSI. Mm-hmm. And with that, then it's pretty simple pipeline, and you have pump stations and it's sequestration. But when you go around that question, really what kind of glues the need to hold all of it together, the big contributor to making this economic are the federal tax credits called 45Q tax credits. Mm-hmm. And the way, with the recent clarity that we had a few months ago out of the federal government around 45Qs, the emitter, the capture equipment at the emission site is the one who qualifies to control the 45Qs. So from an investor perspective, now there are ways to structure around that. Obviously, you can structure around any way you'd like, but the way we contemplate it now is that we would provide all of the capital needed, and we would install the integrated assets. But site by site specific producer customers, they may have a need for those tax credit themselves, or they may have other reasons for us to structure the capture agreement in a certain way. Okay. If that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, it totally does. I was going to ask you about that too, because I know we had talked about the capital investment requirement or not. And so it sounds like there are options, but can definitely be looked at as a non-capital CapEx project if necessary. And then you just be purchasing the CO2 from the plant for their revenue. There's another good.
Yeah, it could. It's going to be in a lot of forms depending on the CO2. whether it's going to be purchased or whether instead of the ethanol plant just emitting it to atmosphere, that it depends on how it will be structured.
True. Bernie has a good question here. Is there any chance CO2 used for enhanced oil recovery in Southwest Nebraska could be qualified for sequestration, like the Oxy-Permian Basin?
Yeah, COR is technically, it qualifies today for 45 Qs. There's just a different price target per ton. General rule of thumb is for EOR, it's about $35 per ton for 45 Q tax credit. And for permanent sequestration or storage, it's $50 a ton. And we have considered and we have looked extensively at transporting anthropogenic or man-made CO2 to EOR sources. We've looked in Louisiana, Texas, Wyoming, and it's a very challenging environment for that. The 45 tax credits at $35, that it really just doesn't work in what we've seen. Now, there's some projects that have effectively mine mouth opportunities. If you go to Wyoming, where there's a lot of products associated with, whether it's helium or other commercialized products that have a lot of CO2, that CO2 maybe right on top of itself could allow for EOR. But when you're looking along the Texas Gulf Coast, primarily along the refinery belt, when you have to build pipelines into those refineries, whether it's a steam methane reformer, it's CO2, it's ammonia plant, whatever the case may be, you still have to transport it, several miles, 50 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles. And if you're trying to go to EOR with only a $35 tax credit, it's a challenge to get capital recovery.
Got it. I don't see any other questions right now. Let me just do a shout out and see if anyone has any other questions before we let you off the hook here.
I could stay here all night, but I know it's late in the afternoon.
I think we're good to go here. So, Jeff, I want to thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was very timely, and the intrastate idea, I think, has some resonance to a lot of people that are on our forum here today. So, thank you for your time and appreciate your information.
All right, thanks, Pam. Appreciate it. Have a good day.